and welcome to this hybrid event to celebrate the International Day of Democracy. My name is Melissa Fleming, and I am the UN Undersecretary General for Global Communications, and I am delighted to be moderating today's discussion. Today is the 15th anniversary of the International Day of Democracy, which was established to provide an opportunity to review the state of democracy in our world. Unfortunately, in our time, the outlook is dire. Democracy is backsliding. Civic space is shrinking. Distrust, mis- and disinformation are growing. This year also marks the 10th anniversary of the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. Although free, independent, and pluralistic media are a cornerstone of democratic societies, they too are under attack. In many parts of the world, media and journalists face increasing obstacles in their ability to operate freely. This has a grave impact on human rights, development, and democracy itself. As a former journalist myself, this topic is dear to my heart, and I have seen firsthand the challenges and the dangers that media experience as they strive to keep the public informed on matters of public interest. So joining me in the studio today are four amazing leaders working to support human rights, media freedom, and democracy. Anne-Marie Ho, my colleague, who is the Executive Director of the UN Office for Partnership and also the UN Democracy Fund, who is our host today. Hi, Anne-Marie.
Hi, Melissa. Good to be here.
Great to be with you. Joining us also here in New York, but remotely, Craig Mokhiber, who is the director of the New York Office for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Welcome, Craig.
Good to be here. Thank you, Melissa.
Zain Al-Moghrabi, who is a human rights activist and director of international programs and growth at the Media and Development Organization Journalists for Human Rights. Welcome, Zain.
Hi, thanks for having me.
In Canada, I may add, and Alphonse Shiundu, who is the Kenya editor for the organization Africa Check. Welcome.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for having me.
Great. Our discussion will focus on the safety of journalists and human rights. And before we dive into it, let's watch a message on the International Day of Democracy by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Today marks the 15th anniversary of the International Day of Democracy. Yet, across the world, democracy is backsliding. Civic space is shrinking, distrust and disinformation are growing, and polarization is undermining democratic institutions. Now is the time to raise the alarm. Now is the time to reaffirm that democracy, development, and human rights are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Now is the time to stand up for the democratic principles of equality, inclusion, and solidarity, and stand with those who strive to secure the rule of law and promote the full participation in decision-making. This year, we focus on a cornerstone of democratic societies: free, independent, and pluralistic media. Attempts to silence journalists are growing more brazen by the day, from verbal assault to online surveillance and legal harassment, especially against women journalists. Media workers face censorship, detention, physical violence, and even killings, often with impunity. Such dark paths inevitably lead to instability, injustice, and worse. Without a free press, democracy cannot survive. Without freedom of expression, there is no freedom. On Democracy Day and every day, let us join forces to secure freedom and protect the rights of all people everywhere. Thank you.
To frame today's conversation, I am joined, as I mentioned, by the Executive Director of the UN Office for Partnerships, Anne-Marie Ho. Anne-Marie, you head up the UN Office for Partnerships, which houses also the UN Democracy Fund. And this fund, I'm sure we're going to learn more about it today, but works closely with civil society around the globe to protect and promote democratic initiatives, including work on media and freedom of information, which is, I think, really fundamental to a thriving democracy. You are a former journalist yourself. The Secretary General notes in his message that a cornerstone of democratic societies is a free, independent, and pluralistic media. Can you expand on this, given what you're seeing through your work and also through your experience?
Thanks so much, Melissa. I mean, we know that a free press is really critical because an informed public can make informed decisions and also hold governments accountable. We need both for democracy to work. When media freedoms are under threat, the flow of information can be stifled, stilted, skewed, and cut off entirely. All of us on this panel, as you've said, we are former journalists or are currently working as journalists. We can see and feel the increased challenges on the ground. As UNESCO has recently reported, 85% of the world's population has experienced a decline in press freedom in their country in just the past 5 years. At the UN Democracy Fund, 30% of our projects work to support media and freedom of information and expression. And I'm going to share with you a few examples. Drafting legal frameworks to access information in the Gambia, combating hate speech in Albania, supporting citizen journalism in Ukraine, and supporting media rights and freedom of expression in Sri Lanka. We're seeing the challenges that our partners are facing, and I really am looking forward to hearing more for both Alphonse and Zain today. That's why this year's International Day of Democracy, we really wanted to highlight the importance of free press. It's for democracy, for peace, and for delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. Thanks, Melissa, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie, and also, wow, what a statistic. 85%, according to a UNESCO survey of the world's population, see a decline in world press freedom. Really concerning. So with that, let's further examine the worrying trends that we are seeing on the decline of media freedom. So my first question goes to Zain Al-Moghrabi. As some of the statistics show, the world is seeing a worrying trend of decline in press freedoms in the past 5 years. And this is taking many forms and exists both online and offline. Can you expand on some of the specific examples of threats and dangers that journalists participating in your projects are experiencing around the world? And maybe just a couple of words to start on your organization so we understand what it's all about and what it does.
Sure thing. I work for Journalists for Human Rights. It's a Canadian media development organization working internationally in particular on the issue of building the capacity of media, independent media across the globe to better and more effectively cover human rights issues and to be the fourth estate and to hold people in power to account.
That's really great to hear. What do you see right now as the trends that we should be most concerned about, and some of the the worrying effects that these trends are having on the ability of journalists to kind of function and perform their vital role in democracies?
Exactly like you said, press freedom has been declining steadily. Moreover, and unfortunately, new and modern threats have emerged during the past decade. In our recent history, anti-democratic forces have utilized oppression by targeting the physical safety and well-being of journalists and spreading misinformation through what we used to call propaganda platforms. What we are witnessing in Journalists for Human Rights through the work that we are doing across many countries is that these forces have taken advantage of the digital age in order to develop their practices on two tracks. Journalists have become an easier target wherever they might be, even if they are physically protected, and misinformation has exceeded its typical potential of spreading inaccurate and false narratives to become a weapon that threatens the very existence of journalism itself. Targeting journalism as the fourth state at large by demolishing the public trust in independent press through This and misinformation aims to replace journalists as a credible source of information with unchecked state-backed agents and, in some cases, extremist-backed agents. For example, for the past couple of years, we were monitoring media consumption about COVID-19 in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa in particular. Content that was conspiracy-based and that spread mistrust in public health institutions, including the World Health Organization, were competing against factual and data-based health reporting on COVID-19. The same unchecked sources were also attacking journalists to discredit their reporting on the same issue. Something similar happened during the conflict in Syria when unchecked resources or sources provided false information to the public that turned into real news. At some point in 2016, humanitarian and development workers paid the price of the misinformation with their own lives under the bombs of warplanes and blind missiles. In 2013 in South Sudan, where we also worked with ANDEF, misinformation was heavily contributing to expanding the conflict and also presenting power dispute as a historical, existential tribal conflict. These emerging threats created an environment where people either conflate misinformation with reporting from legitimate independent media or buy into false narratives that journalists are compromised. When the legitimacy of media comes under question, then journalists, civil society, human rights defenders find themselves advocating for press freedom from a weakened and disempowered place with a limited support from the public. This positions the anti-democratic forces to continue restricting the press more effectively, unfortunately, and to continue with the ongoing decline in press freedom.
Wow, that's really worrying. So that really, you gave us a lot of evidence to show that the digital age has made things worse for journalists. They're easier targets. So it's not only the issues that they are reporting on, that false information can travel easier and faster and can be amplified louder, but also that the very journalists who are trying to portray the credible information are being subject to the attacks as well and turning their legitimacy into question. So we have a problem. Thank you for outlining that, and I hope we can come back to you to talk a little bit more about what can be done. And I think, because really key for us all here at the UN and all the organizations we represent is not only to really alert the world to the problem, but let's talk about what can we do, what are solutions. So thank you very much. To Alphonse Giundu. Can you give us a bit through the lens of your work at Africa Check? Also describe to us a bit what is Africa Check for those who have never heard of it, although everybody should have. What are you seeing? What have the trends been? You've had COVID-19, you've had conflicts, you've had wars, you've had a surge in disinformation on digital channels. What are you most concerned about, and any solutions quick you can see, though I would like to focus on solutions more in the final round.
Thank you, Melissa, for that great multi-layered question. I work with Africa Check, and we are a fact-checking organization in 4 countries in Africa. And the question that you just asked is very timely because in Kenya, we're just coming from a grueling election season, which gave us a front row seat on these aspects of information pollution, the misinformation, disinformation, and the chokehold that these have on media freedom. Now, the work that we do at Africa Check, which is partly powered by ANDEF, is really threefold: to reduce the circulation of false information, to amplify correct information so that we inoculate people against falsehoods, and to do lots of media literacy so that we give people the tools to figure out what's true and what's not by themselves. But when we are dealing with the spectrum of false information in times of heightened competition for power, such as what we just said in Kenya in the last few months, and what we are seeing in different parts of Africa, like in Nigeria, where elections are coming up early next year, it's usually easy to forget how that affects journalists and media houses. We had a situation in Kenya where several social media users, most of them public figures, with a bigger digital following than mainstream media put out false information, like doctored videos with incendiary and inflammatory content. And when journalists called out these folks for spreading obvious falsehoods, their supporters accused the journalists of being biased. And what we saw was very partisan polarization, most of it fueled by false information, to an extent that journalists and media houses became targets of sustained digital criticism in blogs, on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, and even in WhatsApp groups. There was what I would call gendered mis and disinformation, which was really brutal, especially for the female journalists. And why? It's because they asked a male politician a question during the debate, and that the supporters of the politician did not like. And suddenly there are all these manipulated pictures, social media posts, false stories, attacking journalists and spreading falsehoods about their private lives. And as I make this last point, I have to say there's good news. So what helped with the Kenyan election is the unprecedented transparency that we saw from the Electoral Commission, from the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court. These institutions gave journalists, the media, and the media all access to spokespeople, to information, to facts, and patiently explained their processes and decisions. And I think it's that light on facts, that access to information, that trust in the media, in journalists to deliver the information credibly to the public, that made democracy win in the end. Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you for that bit of good news, and that shows that if you have responsible institutions aligned with the journalists, then it works. But one follow-up question, because we read a lot of criticism in the media about Meta in particular, around the Kenya elections, and that despite the warnings that there could be a repeat of election violence that would be spurred by mis and disinformation on social media platforms, that the moderation didn't seem to be working, and that there was a proliferation of false information and actually really hateful language circulating, and very little done to moderate it. What was your observation?
Now, my observation when we look at the work that we do with Meta and with the platforms across, so with Twitter, with TikTok, and all those platforms, we collaborated with them ahead of the elections. And the whole idea of the collaboration was to have fact checkers look at the claims as they show up on the platforms, alert the platforms so that we disrupt that cycle of false information. The only problem is there was an avalanche